that, learning to set aside that kind of fight-flight response is something that the most deprived and dysfunctional parents that we see don't have. They fail to be able to do that. And we see that as children grow up, we begin to see that pervade the system. So just this morning, the emergency mental health nurse was handing over to me a patient, 10-year-old boy, very deprived background, abusive background, sitting in class with his hoodie over his head. And the teacher said, "There's a rule in this class, you don't have your hood over your head." And he just kind of grunted and didn't do anything. And you can predict what happened. Complete escalation, police are called, he's dragged into as an end result of a lot of activities, he's dragged into the emergency department. So, here's the classical response to inappropriately angry behaviour, in this case quite passively angry behaviour. It escalates and we've responded to it as though it's street anger, when in fact it's very much nursery anger that's been misrecognised. Okay. I want to talk now about these two interventions that we have for naughty boys, stimulants and behaviour therapy, and why I don't like either of them very much. If we look at the scientific evidence about stimulants, they have a short-term benefit, but they don't improve in the medium to long term any of the things that we really care about. And taking stimulants in the long term doesn't do you any good, and it may do you some harm. So that, in summary, there's no grounds for anything but short-term use of stimulants.
You can leave it right there, you can summarise now.
One of the many inaccurate things that Pat McGorry has said. Pat McGorry, for those of you who don't know, is last year's Australian of the Year and owns Psychiatry in Australia. One of the things that he said on radio in Adelaide last week is that I'm ideologically opposed to the use of psychiatric medication. That's not in fact the case. But what I do practice is what Joanna Moncrieff, a British psychiatrist, describes as drug-centred, in contrast to disease-centred prescribing. There's no such thing as antidepressant or antipsychotic drugs or anti-ADHD drugs in the same way that there are antibiotics. Antibiotics are antibiotics because they kill bacteria. Antidepressants don't kill depression, they don't treat depression. What we have are a range of psychotropic drugs, that is, drugs that affect the brain, in more or less predictable ways. So most people who take stimulant drugs will have the same response to them, whether or not they've got a disorder. You have decreased purposeless movement and you have increased concentration and attention. And so there are situations in medicine where there's a good match between the profile of a drug and the profile of problems that the person has. And if we can find a drug that matches the person's difficulties, and if the harms of giving the person that drug are outweighed by the potential benefits, the potential harms and the potential benefits, then it would be a good decision to use that drug. And there are certainly situations in medicine where that seems like a good investment. The so-called antipsychotic drugs, which have a terrible numbing effect on our emotions and our thinking, that's a bad thing to do if you're functioning normally, but if you've got all kinds of crazy destructive thoughts leading to all kinds of crazy destructive behaviour, then you will medicate that with those drugs, and that makes sense. That's a good medical decision. But in the vast majority of cases of children with the four presentations that I've talked about, there isn't there either isn't a good match between the pattern of effects that you can expect the drug to have and the pattern of problems that the person has, or more commonly, we can't be convinced that the benefits are going to outweigh the harms. And yet we persist with using drugs, and data doesn't seem to make a difference. And I think John Kenneth Galbraith told us why that might be. Why not behaviour therapy? The kind of behaviour therapy that we use in medicine and in education centres around the interpretation of learning theory that comes under the heading of operant conditioning. Now, operant conditioning and classical conditioning are really probably different ways of describing the same thing, but using a mental framework that is informed by operant conditioning, this is the kind of bad way of doing it, and using the mental framework that is informed by classical conditioning, that's the good way of doing it. So that clearly is an oversimplification, but that's the argument that I want to put forward. And the idea, one of the things that I really hate, and there are lots of things I hate, but one of the things I really hate is the idea that we can have rewards without punishments. And rewards and punishments are just the opposite sides of the coin. The denial of taking a reward away as a punishment, taking a punishment away as a reward. So you can't have rewards without punishments, and just calling punishments consequences doesn't get rid of it either. So how does operant conditioning work? Well, it makes people try harder. And so if we put the boy with the language disorder onto a star chart and we give him rewards for when he behaves well in class, and we don't give him rewards or punish him when he doesn't behave well in class, that might, if we're lucky, get him to try harder, and he might succeed. And if he does, this is when the real effective intervention kicks in. He gets a sense of mastery. And having got that sense of mastery, he's got a strong incentive to keep doing what you want him to do. And you keep putting his stars up on the wall, and he thinks, okay, I might as well humour them. But the star charts are more for the adults than they are for the kids. But trying to change somebody's behaviour by getting them to try harder is undermined by two possible circumstances that are almost universal amongst the kids that I see. The first one is, this kid's already trying as hard as he can. And so if you give him incentives to try harder, all you're going to do is humiliate him, because you're going to give him an increased sense of failure because he tries harder and he still fails. The second scenario that undermines rewards and punishments is that the kid has got better things to think about. The boy who's traumatised by his experience in immigration detention has got all kinds of reward and punishment, mainly punishment chemicals flooding around in his brain. Your little star chart's not going to cut the mustard with that. You're only just playing around on the edges of it. So here's Pavlov's dog, and people will be familiar with the fact that the dog learned to associate the sound of a bell with the fact that it was going to be fed, and so therefore it would salivate with that stimulus. And this is how we learn. We learn by association. And sometimes that's a positive thing, but sometimes it's a negative thing, because we learn to associate, we associate a lot of extraneous stuff to something that's toxic to us. And so if we've got a scary thought, we can put it out of our mind, but in the process of putting the scary thought out of our mind, we put a whole pile of other stuff out of our minds as well. And so what happens is that we get into patterns of avoidance. So the boy with the language disorder doesn't just avoid the situation where the teacher is giving long speeches in the classroom. He comes to avoid a whole pile of other situations and becomes frightened, and that gets reinforced because avoidance is rewarding. This is so-called negative reinforcement. If you avoid something that feels bad, it makes you feel better, and so you avoid it more the next time. So the person with agoraphobia, they walk towards the door, they feel bad, they walk back towards the lounge room, they feel better. So what are you going to do? You're going to stay back here. So what's the difference between operant and classical conditioning? The classical paradigm contains meaning. It leaves space for meaning. Operant conditioning is mindless. And you ask the question, what's this child avoiding? And then as adults or therapists, we have two possible responses. If what he's avoiding is the fact that mum and dad are, there's domestic violence, then there's no point in trying to help him to change. We've got to intervene to try to end the domestic violence. If, on the other hand, it's something that he has the wherewithal to deal with, like the boy with the language disorder, then we might want to make changes to the system in which he's operating, but it might be more about helping him to make changes that involve not being rewarded or punished for various kinds of behaviour, but gradually overcoming his fear and avoidance. And again, we get to the sense of mastery, which is the real payoff. So I'm now on my last section. The Australian Bureau of Statistics tells us that 1 in 4 young Australians have a mental disorder. Now, in fact, that's a misleading statement because really what they found was that 1 in 4 young Australians had a mental disorder in the last 12 months or have it now. And the problem we find when authorities make statements and perhaps unwittingly put a spin on them is that other authorities then take those statements and translate them into something else which is quite destructive. So it goes from the fact that 1 in 4 young Australians have a mental disorder to translate it into a number which is even more scary, and it says they're currently locked out of mental health care but they desperately need. So this has been translated from a survey which might show that the person engages in occasional binge drinking or that they're sad, through to the fact that they're locked out of mental health care that they desperately need. And you can see the problem. There are a number of implications in here. The first implication is that conventional mental health care is going to be helpful to these kids and their families. And the second is that they actually want it at all. And so just now to come to the fourth of my vignettes, which I haven't really talked about yet, the boy who's experiencing what might be a pre-psychotic phenomenon. And this country has just invested over $1 billion in the early psychosis approach. And I feel like if Wayne Swan was to pick up this document, he might feel like a superannuation fund manager who had just invested a third of his portfolio in Lehman Brothers and picked up the New York Times the next day. Because this Cochrane Review, which is the kind of highest order of analysis of psychological information, is giving a pretty lukewarm report to the whole idea of early intervention for psychosis. It's not saying it's a waste of time or that it's destructive, but if this was a Moody's rating, it would be kind of C+ maybe. And we've just invested most of our mental health dollars into this intervention, and at the potential cost of not trying to understand the boy with the potentially psychotic experiences, where he's coming from, what that might be a reaction to, but just feeding him into the factory where he's going to get this not very well evidence-supported intervention. And one of the real problems in mental health and the whole approach to mental health prevention for boys and young men is this mistake of conflating two populations. There are 1 to 2% of boys and young men who have severe disabling mental disorders, you can spot these kids at the bus stop. You don't need to carry out sophisticated assessments.